and welcome to variation 16. This variation is about spiccato and sautillè, and a good way of preparing it is to actually start with slow spiccato and then speed it up until it becomes sautillè. Sautillè is basically the same thing as spiccato, excepting that it's very fast and the bow doesn't bounce as high, so it basically hardly leaves the string. So I'll show you how you can build it up. The best way to do it is to start on one note, and I would recommend to choose a note on the D string, because on the D string the bow angle is more or less parallel to the ground, while as on the G string, A string and E string you have more of an angle, so it's actually easiest on the D string. So start with what's easiest. I would also not recommend an open string, because the open strings are slightly different in spiccato. So if you're working in spiccato and sautillè, it's better to use a string, a note which is stopped and not an open string. So start with something you can likely already do, particularly if you've been working at these 40 variations. Start with a slow spiccato at the frog with a very active finger movement, where the fingers and hands are directing the bow. It's an active movement, not a passive movement. That would be this. When you feel comfortable with that, speed it up a bit, move away from the frog. Don't let the bow leave the string quite as far away, and notice that the finger movement becomes smaller. This is still an active movement. I'm doing everything. I'm not letting anything happen on its own with the bow. I'm directing it completely. If you speed up further and move beyond the point of balance, don't let the bow bounce so high, but let the bow do the bouncing itself and just direct it. You will notice the finger movement becomes smaller. If you move further away towards the middle, speed up, don't let the bow bounce as high, and basically the finger movement becomes even smaller and even more passive. And then you can speed it up even further. That's basically the same thing. So as you speed up, you move away from the frog, and as you speed up, the finger movement becomes more and more passive and smaller and smaller. The movement as such is the same, it just becomes more passive and smaller, and the bow does not bounce as high. Now, developing sautillè out of spiccato, there are a couple of points which you should bear in mind. Basically, the combination of the speed of the bouncing bow, whether it is spiccato or sautillè, and the place of bow, how close to the frog, how close to the middle, or even beyond the middle, and the height of the jumping. Those three components have to match. If you're having trouble getting the bow to bounce, or you're not happy with your spiccato or your sautillè, then most likely somehow these components don't match. For example, if I try to do it too fast, too close to the frog, it won't work, it won't bounce, the bow is too heavy. If I try to bounce too high, it won't work, because the time that the bow needs to leave the string and come back down is too much for the speed. So if you're having troubles with it, try to see if your components are correct. Try to see, for instance, should you go closer to the frog or further away from the frog? Should you bounce less high, and should you try to move even further away from the middle? When I was speeding it up, I was trying to do, and I was terribly frustrated and it didn't work, and then I thought, well, wait a minute, perhaps I should move even further away. So basically, you have to experiment with the place of bow, and that place of bow has to match your speed of spiccato, as well as the height of jumping has to match the speed of spiccato. So it's basically by trial and error, you have to experiment. A couple of other things to bear in mind is to make sure your shoulder and arm is relaxed, because if you're stiff, then you won't be able to be flexible enough for this fast, small, passive movement. So make sure your shoulder and arm is completely relaxed. Another thing which can help is if you tilt your bow slightly towards the bridge. If it doesn't bounce high enough, and like this, if it doesn't bounce properly, just by tilting the bow towards the bridge, you will get it to bounce more. Don't do it too much because otherwise it won't sound. So experiment also with the tilting angle of the bow. Usually if you tilt towards the fingerboard, it becomes softer and the bow doesn't bounce as high. So for fast spiccato and sautillé, you want it to be very, very precise, so it usually helps to tilt the bow towards the bridge. Another thing which can be helpful is to imagine an impulse accent on the first of every 4 notes. That would be... At this speed, it doesn't bring very much, but if you're playing it fast, that can help. If you just imagine giving an impulse accent for every 4. So that can help. So those are a couple of points which could help you with your spiccato. So when you're practicing spiccato and into sautillé, after you've done it on one note, vary the notes, do them on different strings, and then pretty soon start practicing it on scale. So you go... so that you can incorporate this bowing into your scale practice, because that's very, very helpful both for your scales as well as for your bowings. The first thing I always do when I practice this variation is I practice it very slowly, and I do the string crossings in double stops. That will be something like this. I do it right at the frog, very slowly, exaggerating this finger movement and the string crossings in double stops. And so on. The point of this is, on the one hand, to really train this movement. Your fingers have to be able to do it so that they can do it fast and passively later on. The point of the string crossings and double stops, there's multiple purposes for that. The first one is that you're stabilizing your hand position because you have 2 fingers on the strings. You are, of course, improving and correcting and stabilizing your intonation, which is very important. And most of all, particularly when you have fifths straight after each other, place the finger on both strings. That's why it's a good idea to practice the fifth. That will be... The point of that is that when you play this variation fast, you won't have time to move your finger from one string to the next in time. Because remember, your left hand fingers have to be in place before the bow comes onto the string. And in spiccato, and when the sautillé is really fast, you won't have time to move your finger from one string to the next. It has to be on both strings right away. So you might as well practice that right from the start. The other thing why this is so beneficial for the bow is because if you practice the string crossings and double stops, your bow and your hand and your arm will know exactly where the next string is, not approximately, but exactly. And you need to know that because, again, when you do this fast, you have to know where the next string is, and you have to keep the string crossings to a minimum because you won't have time to do large string crossings. So start practicing this using the string crossings as double stops. It's very, very helpful. Also, the left hand becomes more secure because you don't have time to worry about your left hand in this variation. You have to concentrate on the bow. So that's one way that I always start practicing this. No matter how often I've studied this variation, I always start practicing it this way. Then basically build it up exactly like I explained in the preparatory exercises. Speed it up slightly, move to the point of balance or just below. Basically that's still active, but your bow is much faster than it was when it was right down here. Then when you can do that, you speed it up further. You move beyond the point of balance, and as from there it becomes a slightly more passive bow stroke. Basically the bow bounces on its own and my fingers basically react to the movement of the bow and direct it. And then you speed it up further. Etc. until you speed it up all the way, moving away from the frog. And remember the components: place of bow, speed of spiccato, height of jumping. So they have to match. If it doesn't work, most likely something like that is the problem. Another thing which is important to bear in mind is to make sure you hold your fiddle up high. Because if you have it at an angle where it's facing downwards, where the scroll is a lot lower than the bridge, basically the gravity will pull the bow this way and you're continuously working at keeping it in one place. So very often one can simply solve a spiccato problem by making sure that one holds the fiddle up high.